Good morning and welcome to another online Sunday school class with Tunnel Hill Baptist Church. As always, we like to begin by reminding you that we here at Tunnel Hill Baptist Church believe that Jesus is the Christ, that he's the Son of the living God who lived a perfect life and died a sacrificial death for your sins and for mine, and that he rose from the grave 3 days later to give us new life in him. If you'd like more information about what it means to make Jesus Christ your Lord and Savior, we would invite you to follow the link in the description. This will take you to a full gospel presentation. It'll also show you how to respond to the gospel and how to connect with Tunnel Hill Baptist Church. If you live in the Hardin County, Kentucky area, we have worship at 11 o'clock on Sunday mornings. We are both in person and online through Facebook Live. If you do not live in the Hardin County, Kentucky area, we still want to connect with you because we want to help you find a Bible-believing church where you do live. As we continue on in our study of the books of Joshua, Judges, and Ruth, we are now in session 3, which is titled Remembering God's Works. And we're going to be looking at Joshua chapter 3, starting in verse 14, and then carrying that over to Joshua chapter 4, verse 9. So again, this is session 3, titled Remembering God's Works, looking at Joshua 3, 14 through to Joshua 4, 9. As we get started, the book actually begins with a question, and I want us to begin with this question as well. And the question is this: what are some prominent memorials that you can think of, and why are they significant, and what impact do they have on people today? And so we're going to ask questions throughout our study, and we want to give you an opportunity to respond to those questions. And so as we ask questions, we're going to encourage you to pause the video and then take some time to answer that. If you're watching this by yourself, get a pen, paper, maybe a notebook, take some notes as you go along, and then when we ask a question, write down that question and give yourself some time to respond to it. Or if you're watching this with your spouse, family, or friends, we would encourage you, pause the video, have a conversation, actually discuss the questions that we ask, and then in both cases, whether you're writing or you're having a discussion, whenever you're ready, just hit play again, and then we'll keep moving right along in our study. Now, again, the question is this: what are some prominent memorials that you can think of, and why are they significant? What impact do they have on people today? Take a couple minutes, pause the video, answer those questions, and then we'll keep rolling in our study. All right, so hopefully you've had some time to answer that question. I know for me personally, when I think of those type of memorials, I think of where great battles were fought, something like Gettysburg, or some things that are over related to the either the Civil War or the Revolutionary War. I'll tell you that one of the most impactful memorials that I've got to see was I actually got to go one time up to New York City and see the 9/11 memorial, and kind of just walk around and look at the names and just kind of be present for a little bit. And that had a significant impact on me because it just reminded me of what happened and the lives that were lost, and even just kind of with that a celebration of the brave men and women that went into those buildings and went into that after it happened, and really many of which gave their life trying to rescue other people. And it just had an impact on me, and just really helped me to appreciate those people and the sacrifice that they had made. That leads the book to open with these words, and it says this: archaeologists have discovered that ancient civilizations erected statues and built monument structures to celebrate and memorialize significant people and events. These memorials helped following generations understand their identity and recognize how they became who they are. In the Bible, God often instructed his people to erect memorials, and it was so that they would never forget who God is and never forget that they belong to him, and always remember that they could trust him in the present as well as in the future. When we think about what memorials do, is they serve as a reminder to us of what has happened in the past, and also challenge us to look to the future and to take their example and allow it to have a significant impact on us. Today's session focuses on how Israel memorialized God's mighty works on behalf of them as they finally set foot in the promised land. The book has this to say, and it says that at that time of year, the Jordan's banks were overflowing. Nevertheless, when the priest stepped into the water receded, making it a dry path for Israel to cross. They would even Israelite, excuse me, When every Israelite had completely crossed the Jordan, the Lord commanded Joseph to choose 12 men, one from each tribe, to take a stone from the riverbed. As we look into our passage today, we're going to see what they did with those stones, and we're going to see how God commanded Joshua to use those stones to build a memorial at a place called Gilgal. Let's dive deeper into this passage today as we begin our study. As you'll remember from previous times, we've already had God commission and set apart Joshua for the work of taking the promised land. We saw last week how they had spied out the land and how the land was really truly been prepared for Israel and prepared for them to take it. And today we're going to see them begin to take those first steps. And so let's dive into our study today. Let's begin in Joshua chapter 3, and we're going to begin by reading verses 14 through 17. As we do so, I want you to really pick up on the details that are present from this passage. Picking up in verse 14, we read these words. It says, "When the people broke camp to cross the Jordan, the priests carried the Ark of the Covenant ahead of them. Now the Jordan overflowed its banks throughout the harvest season. But as soon as the priests carrying the Ark reached the Jordan, their feet touched the water at its edge, and the water flowing downstream stood still, rising up in a mass that extended as far as Adam, a city next to Zarethan. The water flowing downstream into the Sea of Araba, that is the Dead Sea, was completely cut off, and the people crossed opposite Jericho. The priests, carrying the Ark of the Lord's covenant, stood firmly on dry ground in the middle of the Jordan, while all of Israel crossed on dry land until the entire nation had finished crossing the Jordan." As we look at this, we do get quite a few details here. One, we have that the Levites carried the Ark of the Covenant in, and as soon as their feet touched water, the miracle started to happen. As soon as their feet touched water, the miracle started to happen, and the water stood still. It began to heap up on one side, and it went down into the Dead Sea on the other. And because of that, it was dry land in front of them. It says that that happened as soon as their feet touched the water, but it says that they walked all the way into the middle of the Jordan to do that. And then the people crossed on dry land. And it gives you kind of all of the what happened and what other towns and cities were affected. You get all these kind of great details that speak to the significance and just the historicity and the fact that this is a historical event. The book has this to say about it. It says the event happened in the spring when the Jordan River was at its flood stage. Typically, the Jordan was not difficult to cross. Throughout most of the year, the Jordan was anywhere from 3 to 10 feet deep and 90 to 100 feet wide. However, it being at flood stage means that the water was overflowing the banks, which also means that the depth and the width of the river was significantly deeper and wider than normal. With these conditions, the river appeared to be impassable to cross. These circumstances highlighted just how amazing the miracle was. And so it's not like this was a short stream that God did just to conveniently let them go on dry land. This was a barrier that was going to keep them from doing what God had told them to do. I kind of halfway wonder, even as I was reading this, if the people of even Jericho thought, well, at least we know Israel's not coming for the next several weeks or months or whatever, because the Jordan is too full and the Jordan is flooding it in the flood stages right now. And so at least we know they're going to stay over there until after the flooding and the harvest season is done. And I can only imagine their shock when they learned that in reality they came right on over and that God was with them from the beginning. It does lead the book to ask an interesting question. We begin to think of our spiritual journey and the barriers that might exist with that. And it asks this question, it says, why are barriers an important part of our spiritual journey? So we look at this passage and we know that God has commanded them to take the promised land. We know that Jericho is first on the order of cities to take, and yet they have this huge barrier of the Jordan River. I apologize that I keep yawning. This huge barrier of the Jordan River, but this was important. This was significant, and God was going to show up through this. Why are barriers an important part of our spiritual journey? Take a couple minutes, pause the video, answer that question, and then we'll keep going in our study. All right, so the book said this. It said the Jordan River presented a barrier for Israel reaching the promised land. And I think a lot of times those are things that we experience as well when we are trying to serve the Lord, when we are trying to do something that matters. We see those roadblocks, we see those barriers. And one of the things we have to remember in all of those is that nothing is impossible with God. We recognize that even though there may be events in our life and there may be times where we find ourselves in front of roadblocks, we find ourselves dealing with things that might keep us from following him, we can recognize that if God is calling us to do it, and if we are confident that God is moving in this area, God's going to work, and that God is going to move through all of that, and it is going to be good, and his grace and his mercy are going to help us overcome those things, and we will see how God has moved in these events even when we thought they were barriers. Now, this doesn't mean that God is always going to overcome every barrier 100% of the time, because obviously there are times where that is not God's plan for us. Sometimes God will lead us so far, but then have us change course, and all of that was preparation for something else. We don't know that, but we do know that if God wants us to do something, if he is seeing us to finish a task, he will see it through, and we can trust him in that. Let's kick over to the next chapter now. Let's begin in Joshua chapter 4, and we're going to read verses 1 through 7. And I want you to see what God does in this. So what we've established already is that the Levites have taken the Ark of the Covenant. They've led the people. They've gone down into the Jordan. It is separated. They've gone down into the center of the Jordan. It is dry land, and the people have crossed. And let's see what happens after that. We're going to read those first 7 verses of Joshua chapter 4. And it says this. It says, after the entire nation had finished crossing the Jordan, the Lord spoke to Joshua. Choose 12 men from the people, 1 man from each tribe, and command them, take 12 stones from the place in the middle of the Jordan where the priests are standing, and carry them with you, and set them down at the place where you spend the night. So Joshua summoned the 12 men he had selected from the Israelites, 1 man from each tribe, and said to them, go across to the ark of the Lord your God in the middle of the Jordan. Each of you lift a stone onto his shoulder, 1 for each of the Israelite tribes, so that this might be a sign among you. In the future, when your children ask you, what do these stones mean to you? You should tell them, the water of the Jordan was cut off in front of the ark of the Lord's covenant when it crossed the Jordan. The Jordan's water was cut off. Therefore, the stones will always be a memorial for the Israelites. I love so much about this because what we see happening here is that they're crossing the Jordan. In the midst of them crossing the Jordan, they are walking through, and God tells them, says, hey, you're going to do all these things, and as you do them, I want you to have 1 person from each tribe pick up a stone. And I imagine it would have been a pretty significant sized stone. In fact, it says it was big enough to put on their shoulder. So these would have probably been tough men who could have taken a rock, put it on their shoulder, and carry it a distance until they get to where they're camping that night. And they pick up 12 rocks, 1 representing each tribe, a person from each tribe carrying it from there. And he says, you're going to go and we're going to put this where we lay down and where we camp out. And we're going to make a memorial. This pile of rock is going to be a memorial for what God did. And I imagine it would have been an interesting thing to see because these rocks had been in the bottom of a river. They'd been in the bottom of a river for a while, so they would have been smooth. They would have been kind of noteworthy. They would have been different than the rocks that you might have just found out on the ground, and that they were going to pile them up and let that serve as a memorial so that when their children would come across them and see these smooth stones, these stones that were very clearly had been at the bottom of a river for who knows how long, for years, decades, who knows how long, they would see them and say, hey, that's weird. Look how these smooth rocks are piled together. What does this mean? And that would be a remembrance to you. That would be a reminder to you to say, those were the rocks that were pulled from the bottom of the Jordan when the Ark of the Covenant went into the Jordan and separated it so that we could cross on dry land. And so it was going to serve as this memorial or this reminder of what God had done that day. The book says it this way. It says the stones would be a memorial of what God had done that day, cutting off the waters from the Jordan in front of the Lord's ark and allowing the people to cross the river on dry ground into the promised land. Certainly, this memorial was to serve as a reminder to the people who crossed the Jordan that day. It was also to be a witness to generations to come. When their children would ask them what the meaning of the stacked stones was, the parents would tell them what God had done. And that leads the book to ask this question, which is, what are some milestones that could remind people of God's work in their lives? So you may not have a monument built for what God has done in your life, but there are probably some events in your life that really symbolize and really view a kind of work as monuments of how God has worked in your life. As you look at your life, what are some of those monuments? What are some of those milestones that remind you that God has been at work in your life this whole time? Take a couple minutes, pause the video, answer that question, and then we'll keep going in our study. All right, so let's talk about some of those things. We're obviously going to talk about maybe when you gave your life to Christ, or if there's been a point in your life where you've rededicated your life to Christ and begun to have a renewed thing. For some, that might be how you surrendered to a call of ministry. When I think of that in my life, that when I realized God was calling me to serve and to serve the church, that was a significant thing. For me personally, there's a couple of the events that really make a difference to me was when I left my home and moved to Kentucky in order to go to school and serve at a church. And also when I left the church that I had grown up in and went on staff at my first church. All of these kind of look to me as these road signs or these memorials or road marks, if you will, that tell me like, hey, this has been how God has been moving in my life for years and years and years. The establishment of this memorial should be a challenge to all of us to remember what God has done in our lives. Beyond that, we have to be willing to share this work with others, including younger generations. After the people had crossed over the river onto dry ground and collected the stones, it was time to build the monument. So let's read that last part. We're going to read verses 8 and 9, and I want you to listen for the monument and try to think about how many maybe are being mentioned here at this time. 8 and 9 say this. It says, the Israelites did just as Joshua had commanded them. The 12 men took stones from the middle of the Jordan, one for each of the Israelite tribes, just as the Lord had told Joshua. They carried them to the camp and set them before them. Joshua also set up 12 stones in the middle of the Jordan, where the priests had carried the Ark of the Covenant, and they were standing, and the stones are still there today. So there's a little bit of confusion about this one, and there's a chance. It seems very likely that there were actually two sets of stones that were built. One was built at the camp at Gilgal, where they set up camp that night, but then possibly another one was built where the Levites stood with the ark. And so as they picked up rocks, they took one with them and maybe set one there, and they built a kind of memorial in the middle of the river. And the idea there being that it eventually was washed over again with the water and probably remained. And so that one has remained untouched in the bottom of the Jordan, even maybe until today. And so we have that one there, but then we also have the visible one, the one at Gilgal that they did. And they did exactly as they told him. We're seeing that obedience, that not only that they were obeying what Joshua told them, but in reality, they were obeying what God had commanded them to do, and they obeyed his word in all of that. And so you kind of see here, there's a little bit of debate whether this is just talking about the same thing, and they're just saying like, hey, they did it, and then and then there's just kind of some word order stuff. But it seems very likely that two were made, one at the bottom of the river and one where they camped the first night, to be reminded, hey, this really happened. And I guess even to the point where if there was a drought and the water would to dry up in the Jordan, or if at some point that got dammed up and you could see, you would find this pile of rocks in the middle of the Jordan to remind the people that, yeah, the Israelites really did walk through the Jordan on dry land. The book has this to say. It says, 12 men set stones in the camp. Verse 19 indicates that the camp was located in Gilgal, a place that would have great significance in the life of Israel going forward. Thus, generations to come would have the opportunity to learn the meaning of the 12 stones. Then there's a lot of questions that the book asks that I think we should tackle. The first one is, why would it be important for the Israelites to know that the monument was still there? Because you have that at the very end that says, hey, this monument is still there. Why is that important? Well, because they can go and look. It's something that says, hey, this is here, and this was during the time of this writing, this is still over there. And for years to come, generations to come, and I don't know if it's still there even today, you would be able to go to Gilgal and see the stones that they had pulled from the river and set there to tell you that this has happened. It was something intended to be a witness to say, hey, everything we're writing in this book, everything that we have in the scriptures, everything that Joshua wrote down, these really happened. This is proof of this. This is evidence of this. This is something that you can look at, and it shows you that when they did it, that was the intention. The intention was for you to be able to see it and be able to know what was going on. Along with that, how do the events of our lives help us to believe, and even help other people to believe, and how do they serve as memorials of God's work in our life? And I'd like you to pause the video and answer that question. And I want you to think about this for a second. What events are there, and how have the events of your lives served as a memorial to how God was at work? And I want you to, we kind of answered that question already, but this is a little bit of a different take on it. And when you look at your life, what are the memorials? What are the things in your life that remind you that God has been at work in your life? And then how do they remind you? I'd love for you to share. If you want to share that in the comments of this video, I would love that. That would mean the world to me. But otherwise, just as you're doing your study, what are those events in your life that remind you that God is at work, and how do they remind you that God is at work? Take a couple minutes, pause the video, answer that question, and then, believe it or not, we're going to start wrapping up our study. All right, so hopefully you've been able to come up with a few things. When we look at, I think when I look at my life and seeing how God has been at work, I think my wife plays a huge role in that, and just getting to marry her is a reminder of God's redemption in my life. Same with my kids being born, being called as the pastor of this church, being here over 10 years has been a big part of that. Seeing people come to saving faith, or seeing God just move in some unbelievable way through some of the things that I've got to be a part of throughout the years of ministry. All of those serve as reminders of what God can do and how God has been working in my life. And there's just this thing to it that just says, like, hey, God is doing something. I couldn't have done this on my own. I could have done everything the exact same way, and it could have gone horribly wrong. But because God was in it, it went horribly right, and everything was great. That leads the book to ask one final question, and we're going to talk about it just a little bit afterwards, but I want you to ask this one final question. It's this: how can previous experience with God strengthen a person's faith? And how can we pass on our faith to future generations? So this is a great question. How can our previous experiences with God strengthen our faith, but then also how can we pass on those experiences? How can we pass on our faith and those stories to the next generation? Take a couple minutes, pause the video, answer that question, and then we'll wrap up our time together. All right, so hopefully you've had some time to think about that. I think this is a great question, and I've said this many times before, and I hope somebody's listening to me when I say this. One of the best things you can do as an adult is share how you came to saving faith, and share how you came to where you are in your relationship with Christ, with your kids, your grandkids, your nieces and nephews, anybody that, any of that younger generation, even kids in the church. They should know that. I think that every parent should tell their kids how they came to saving faith, that their kids should know that story. They should know that this is how God worked in my mom and dad. This is how God worked in my grandma and grandpa and all that. I think that's an important thing. If you can write it down, that would be even better. But I think you should tell the story. And I think you should tell it often. I know for a fact that my grandmother was saved at camp one time. She went to church camp as a kid. Excuse me. It was a church camp that ultimately I attended the same kind of camp. I don't think it was at the same place. And she was at camp one day and she heard the gospel preached. She'll tell you she doesn't really remember what was preached, but she just knew that that was the day she needed to give her life to Jesus. And so at the end of the service, she went up front and talked with somebody and prayed to receive Christ as her Lord and Savior. And I think that's awesome. And I think that's great. And I think we should have those stories, and we should know those stories. We should know how God has worked through those lives. Even today, I don't necessarily know how my dad came to saving faith, but I can tell you stories about how God strengthened my dad's faith and how God did things in my dad's life to make him the man of God that I knew him was. And I know those stories, and I get to pass those on to my kids and hope maybe my grandkids one day. And I just want to encourage you today, take the time to share with your kids and your grandkids how you came to saving faith, even if they're already believers. Take the time to share with them, because you have no idea how you sharing what God has done in your life with someone else might have a huge impact on their life. And so I want to just encourage you to do that. As we close out our time together, I want to just take some time, and I think we should take some time and just give thanks to God. I think as we close out our time today, we should take a couple minutes and we should just praise God for who He is and how He has been active in our lives. And then also to have Him challenge, and then also ask God to give us opportunities to show that and to tell that great story with other people. I love that classic hymn that says, I love to tell the story of Christ and His love. And I think that's what we should be challenging ourselves to do. So here's how I want you to close out your time. We've talked about how our past experience will strengthen our faith and how we might pass those on. I want you to take some time and pray over that. I want you to pray over how you might share your faith journey and your faith experience with your kids, or maybe your grandkids, or your friends, or your family, whoever might want to hear it. And really maybe even take some time, and if you're writing down, or if you want to have the discussion, talk about what are those events in your life that you would want your kids to know about in your life, and how they shaped your faith and how they shaped your relationship with God. So take some time, think about those things, lift up a prayer to God, giving Him thanks for how He has worked in your life, and then pray for those opportunities that you might share the good news of what God has done in your life with other people, specifically with the next generation. Thank you so much for joining us today. We would invite you to join us for worship right here at Tunnel Hill Baptist Church. It's at 11 o'clock today. We are both in person and online through Facebook Live. Thanks again for joining us. God bless.